with his Paul Harris Fellow. Note, he's wearing his Paul Harris Fellow.
Actually, I could have worn the other one as well. But I thought 2 was pushing it a bit. Thank you, Charlene. I'm not sure. I think she may be a little bit wasted on ITV News. She's a natural-born evangelist, isn't she? The various causes being presented to you today were not competing. We're just showing aspects of the real world that we know about. In fact, I'm also a great supporter of the Soldiers' Charity. I did an event for them in Exeter Cathedral last year. And there were 3, and because I'm an ex-soldier myself, much less distinguished than the Major General. I'm a former corporal, you see. And your study of German history will tell you that we ex-corporals can be a dangerous bunch. There were 3 major generals in the audience, so I gave my other ranks perspective, because besides being UNICEF ambassador, I wish you to know that since 2 years ago, I'm a published poet. So I wrote this: "It isn't wise in matters regimental to be much in awe of the brass and the parade, and the colonels in the great parade with glittering gongs in rows and rows of OBEs and DSOs. The army's run by its NCOs. The officers are mainly ornamental." I hope he's gone. I'm sorry, boss, I didn't mean it. But any of you who've served in the military will know the truth of this. Watch now, this one. If you wish to avoid mishaps on a line of confrontation, just know that officers and maps are a dangerous combination. It's been a long and winding road from being a reluctant corporal to being a volunteer and goodwill ambassador for UNICEF. I've found what I'm talking about now comes from the heart and from experience. It's not paperwork. I think I've been in 18 war zones, which is probably more than it's comfortable to be in. And I've learned how dangerous the world is out there. Much more now than I think than it used to be. I started in Vietnam and I ended in Bosnia. I didn't only do wars, I did lots of other things. I once attended one of Idi Amin's weddings. He was marrying Lady Sarah of the mechanized suicide regiment of the Ugandan army. I'm not making this up. Last heard of working in a fast food joint near West Ham football ground. I've had a calypso written against me in St. Lucia, accusing me of taking bribes to denigrate the good name of the island. I even tried my hand at royal reporting. I once dared, on a nature reserve in the Cayman Islands, to ask the Duke of Edinburgh why he was in favour of conserving wildlife abroad and shooting it at home. You should have seen his face. And then when it was all over, I turned up as an MP in rather unlikely circumstances. Well, we had sleaze in those days. And it was the most shocking experience of my life, those 4 years. But when it was over, the phone rang the next week, and it was UNICEF. And UNICEF, I'd worked alongside as a reporter. I'd seen them in action. They said, would I be willing to be one of their goodwill ambassadors? UNICEF is United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund. It's always had these ambassadors since Danny Kaye and Audrey Hepburn in the 1950s. But times and tastes change. Now they have Robbie Williams and David Beckham. But they can't send them to the war zones, so they send me. I'm the expendable ambassador. And I get access there and insights of a kind that I never had in my 34 years as a war reporter. I'll offer you a few verbal snapshots. In Yemen, 7 wars in 8 years, virtually unreported. The victim of one of them was a 9-year-old girl who had lost her father when their house in the north of the country was hit by a precision-guided missile. She was with her mother. She was suffering from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, shell shock, what we used to call, and I've never seen such eyes. She didn't know who she was or where she was. And you know the difference between PTSD, shell shock, in children and in soldiers? In children, it lasts longer. Also in Yemen, one of our duties is where we do our best at child protection. There's a terrific amount of people trafficking in that very difficult country. And in a prison there, we found an 8-year-old Nigerian boy with one arm in a prison. You know the occupation which it's more useful to have one arm than two? It's begging. He was being trafficked into Saudi Arabia as a beggar. Well, we've saved him, and he's now back in Nigeria. There are so many things we have to do, so many things we try to do to rescue children and their childhoods, which are stolen from them, especially in wars. One of our causes is the demobilization and disarmament of child soldiers, principally, but not only in Africa. It's one of the most frightening phenomena of our time. When I was a soldier, we had the old bolt-action Lee Enfield, which is not child's play. Unfortunately, the Kalashnikov is, and it is easily carried by an 11 or a 12-year-old. These are the victims of war, and they are rounded up and used first of all as servants and guards, and then as soldiers. The AK-47, there must be 1 million of them washing around Africa at the moment. Of course, they're the invention of the greatest gunsmith of the 20th century, General Kalashnikov, who just died a few months ago. And in his old age, he gave a very revealing interview in which he said that he wished he had invented the lawnmower. It is such a dangerous world out there that many of the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, they tend to be sometimes intimidated because it is so difficult for them to work. I was in Bosaso, which is in the north of Somalia. This is very much the province of the pirates. And 2 marvelous doctors had been working in a nutrition center, saving the lives of newborn babies. But they were kidnapped and ransomed, and they were then released, but they had to leave the country. And the gap again was filled by UNICEF and its local staff. And in the capital, Garowe, we met the president of Puntland, which is the province of the pirates. And he was trying to de-glamorize the activity of piracy. He was trying to persuade his young men not to become pirates and his young women not to marry them. And we learned there that the year before I was there, $150 million had been dropped by parachute on the pirates, paid by the ship owners to release their ships. You know what they did with it? They used it to build a shopping mall in Nairobi. It's an extraordinary world out there. And in Nairobi, flying up, I met the mayor of Mogadishu, who talked about his fine city and invited me to visit it. Well, 5 days later, it was half overrun by a force of 4,000 al-Shabaab. These are jihadist fighters. And the first thing they did was to set up 3 schools to teach the jihadists the techniques of suicide bombing. This is such a dangerous world. In South Sudan, I met a young boy of 13 who, when he was 11, had been kidnapped by the Lord's Resistance Army, the most notorious group of bandits in the world, led by the world's most wanted man, Joseph Kony, still at large. They operate on the unmarked, unguarded borders between the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Central African Republic, and South Sudan. And this boy had been kidnapped when he was 11. And forgive me for sharing it with you, but he had been forced to club his father to death. There are things out there which we in our settled and ordered life can hardly imagine. And they put me in mind of something said by Elie Wiesel, the most eloquent survivor of the Holocaust, who said this. He said, "It's not because I cannot explain that you won't understand, it's because you won't understand that I cannot explain." But these are stories from the field that I want to share with you. The last one is of a women's prison in Herat. That's up in Afghanistan, up against the border with Iran. And we got access to this. There were 40 teenage girls there who had been traded into marriage when they were children, engaged to be married at 9, married at 11 to complete strangers old enough to be their grandfathers. And here again, it's an issue of child protection to trying to rescue these girls. And like all the problems of Afghanistan, none of them are ever going to be solved by force. We British are now withdrawing from our 4th Afghan war at quite a cost, and guess who won the other 3? We didn't. But the work goes on. And one of the things they're doing there, and here we make common cause, is in the fight against polio, in which Rotary has been absolutely magnificent. When I was last in Afghanistan, there were 4 countries where polio was still endemic: Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, and Nigeria. And it was closest to being eliminated in Afghanistan of those 4. And if the Afghans can do that in time of war, what can they not achieve in peace? However, now, within the last few weeks, there have been outbreaks in Syria and in Iraq, which had been polio-free for 14 years. We in UNICEF and others working alongside us, are facing horrendous difficulties of access in Iraq. There are more than 1 million children there under siege. Another 1 million have left the country. The war is now entering its 4th year, and it is our priority, every last child. But again, I don't see a military solution there. I'm old enough to have seen a lot of attempts at military solutions. I go back to Vietnam. And all we can do is what we were striving to do on the borders in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Jordan, and in the country itself. And the more I work for UNICEF, the more I realize that we don't achieve anything by competing with other agencies and organizations. The UN is one family. I've seen the UN at its best and its worst. It's at its best in its agencies and its wonderful staff, the international and the national staff who risk their lives. I saw it at its worst, I suppose, in Bosnia. I was the BBC's principal reporter there at the time of the Srebrenica massacre, which occurred when there were 32,000 UN troops there. So we work with people. On polio, we work with the World Health Organization. In the camps, of course, we work with UNHCR, which is the UN's refugee agency. Which brings me, very timely, to the story of Angelina and I. Yes, that's Angelina. If you ever Google my name against hers, I'm not especially recommending it, you will find the most obsequious, creepy-crawly celebrity interview ever conducted on the internet. I did it at a wonderful award ceremony in Geneva 2.5 years ago to thank Angelina Jolie for her 10 years service to the UN's refugee agency, in the course of which time she's managed to find the time to go on 40 very effective field missions. And in that interview, she explains how to her, refugees are not a burden, but they are an inspiration. So far, 77,000 people have visited that interview, and none of them did so to look at me. I believe from where I've been and what I've seen that we live in the most dangerous times since 1945. We live in an age of nuclear proliferation, of sudden catastrophic climate events, and I believe these connect with man-made disasters. The conflict in Darfur, which is in the west of Sudan, has now been continuing for 10 years, and it is probably the first war of climate change. And one of its root causes is the competition for water and arable land between the Arabs, who tend to be nomadic, and the Africans, who tend to be farmers. And there are hundreds of thousands of people caught up in this. And again, UNICEF is there, and again, it takes risks. While I was still an MP, I went on a mission for UNICEF to Burundi, which was torn by the civil war 20 years ago, as Rwanda was. And I was actually the head of the delegation. There were two other MPs. They were both Labour MPs. I didn't have a party, obviously. But I was the head of delegation, and I discovered that the West was applying sanctions which weren't working. So I made a speech in my fractured French, supporting the people and attacking the application of sanctions. Fortunately, the two Labour MPs didn't speak French, so they didn't know what I was saying. And sometimes you go to these countries and you'll find the UN people going on these huge four-wheel drive with vast aerials, and I thought, is this really necessary? And then, 8 weeks after we left, our host, Luis Zuniga, who was a Chilean, a wonderful man who was head of the mission there, he was assassinated in a refugee camp. The aid work that is being done comes at a constant high price, like Sergio de Mello, the UN head in Iraq, who was blown up in his headquarters in August 2003. These people take risks, much more, I think, than the war reporters, the sort of job that I used to do. I mean, they're mostly embedded now, but every now and again, one of them goes. And it reminds me of obviously I was faced some very difficult situations in Bosnia, because it was especially getting into Sarajevo in those days, because there were no flights. The only way in was across the airport runway driving, and the Serbs were at either end and the armed Muslims at either side. And I was driving a battered old BBC Vauxhall Carlton, and of course it got hit by gunfire, but it must have been the end of the trajectory of the rounds. I was driving, and it hit the driver's door without actually penetrating it. So afterwards, I wrote to Vauxhall and thanked them very much for making a tank without knowing it. There are great movements of refugees, probably now more than at any other time since 1945, and UNICEF was partly set up to help the blitzed children in the cities of Europe after the Second World War. Well, in an ideal world, its work would not be necessary. We do not live in an ideal world, and its work is more necessary than ever. There are great tides of refugees going from West Africa to the Canary Islands, from the north of Africa to the islands of the southern Mediterranean, and from the east, from Somalia, which is war-torn, to Yemen, which is also war-torn. And these are very difficult places for people to work. We live in such uncertain times. I don't know if you're aware of black swan events. In the military academies, they study black swan events. Black swan events are things that happen that are sudden, unpredicted, probably unpredictable and catastrophic. The analogy arises from the discovery of black swans in Australia in the 19th century. We'd always thought that one of the defining characteristics of a swan was white feathers. Well, not necessarily. And 9/11 was the archetypal black swan event. So we have to be prepared for the unexpected. I've had a feel. I think I'm probably one of the oldest people here. One of those kids were so inspiring. I don't remember being that idealistic. I think I was rather selfish when I was a kid. I've just been studying some letters that I sent as I was a young corporal in the Suffolk Regiment, and they were hopelessly self-censored, they were self-centered, they were xenophobic, and they were awful. But these kids are really good. And I've discovered as I got older, I now describe myself as a battle-softened veteran, because and sometimes people say, well, you've had an interesting life, haven't you? I said, it's not over yet. I'm just accelerating into the home straight. Oh, I forgot to tell you I've got an Angelina poem as well. I put it in my book. I used to think, till I met Angelina, the far side of the hill was always greener. But now I've met her, I can see the place where I would rather be is on the same hillside as Ms. Jolie. Something I discover, though, is the time, just a little back to UNICEF. What we're trying to do now, we are trying to reach out beyond what we used to do, which was just dealing the effects of the world's calamities. They're both man-made and natural, and sometimes they intersect. A classic case of this was the tsunami on Boxing Day 2004. Of all the countries, 250,000 people died there. And in two countries, there was already civil wars raging, struck by the tsunami. One was part of Philippines, Aceh province, and the other was Sri Lanka. And there I saw what had been a brigade, an army post of the Sri Lankan army on an island in an estuary. And because it was close to the Tamil Tigers, it was protected with anti-personnel mines and landmines. And of course, the tsunami then washed them away. So you have man-made calamities and natural calamities intersecting. And there's no knowing where those mines have got to. This is the kind of thing that happens in the world. I find that, you laugh or you cry. I find that I sometimes think, what should the motto of UNICEF be? Maybe every last child, because that's our feeling at the moment in Syria. Or it might be the old motto of the commandos, which was to bash on regardless, because we see what's going on out there in the world, and the difficulties, for instance, in just of access now in Syria are so overwhelming. But we have to keep at it, and this is what we're doing with our partners. And I think in some respects, the spread of polio, and you've been so good and effective in the cause of the eradication of polio, well, there's work to be done. There's work to be done. There's always work to be done. And I've been doing this now for 10 years. It's partly awareness raising, it's partly money raising, it's partly lobbying people. And one of the things we're doing now is shifting the emphasis a bit from effects to causes, and spending a lot of time with governments. And for instance, on the issue of child soldiers, we have to reach out to reach out to the military. And I think, we're slowly getting there. There are some issues on which we've made terrific progress, child protection especially. There are others in which, as they're always saying, they're sort of challenging. I wrote 2 reports for UNICEF called Child Alerts. And normally the UN agencies, they're full of issues and challenges. Well, I did have issues and challenges. And when I presented it in Geneva, they asked me, is that a real UN report? Because it's written in non-UN language. No, I said, it's my report. But it was in the name of UNICEF. And it's in the name of the children that we do what we do. Children who have no chance because their childhoods have been stolen from them, whether by war, by enlistment, by illness, by suddenly becoming refugees. We do what we can when we can, and I know we have to do more, and we have to reach out to our partners, which is what we are doing. There's much more advocacy involved and much more politics. And the kind of issue we have been effective on, for instance, is the elimination of anti-personnel mines. Things do happen. I've nearly done, but I've just got one of my other little poems here. I find as I get older, I've got to do more and more. And something I've discovered, time just doesn't pass, it accelerates. What's now a slog was once a caper. The less we have, the more we spend. Life's like a roll of toilet paper. It unwinds faster at the end. Finally, so many of our difficulties arise from misunderstandings, not understanding each other. I use this, I lecture on cruise ships, and I use this final story as a symbol of our lack of understanding. And I know it's true because a retired US Navy captain on a cruise ship came up to me last year and he said he heard it. It's an exchange of radio messages between the Americans and the Canadians in the North Atlantic in October '94. First of all, you hear the Americans: request you change your course 14 degrees to the north to avoid a collision. To which the Canadians reply: request you change your course 14 degrees to the south to avoid a collision. The Americans come back, I say again, change your course 14 degrees to the north. And the Canadians reply, I say again, you change your course 14 degrees to the south. Now the Americans are getting quite upset. This is the captain of the USS Abraham Lincoln, second largest capital ship in the Atlantic Fleet. We have with us 3 frigates, 4 destroyers, and numerous support ships. I say again, change your course 14 degrees to the north, or this battle group will take action to defend itself. To which the Canadians replied, this is a lighthouse, your call. Thank you.